Some breaking news now in Burkina Faso. There are reports that 200 soldiers have been killed in attacks by an al-Qaeda affiliate. It happened in the northern province of Loroum. The attacks follow an earlier assault in which 60 soldiers were killed at a military post in the same province. Nearly half of Burkina Faso is not under government control, and attacks from armed groups linked to al-Qaeda on the rise, not only in Burkina Faso but other African countries in the Sahel.
In the golden haze of Burkina Faso's northern plains, something extraordinary happened. Something that's forced the world to look twice at a small, war-torn country long dismissed as fragile and fading. A coordinated military ambush, unlike anything the Sahel has seen in years, resulted in the deaths of over 1,000 armed militants. It wasn't carried out by NATO or foreign troops or mercenaries. It was led by a 36-year-old captain named Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's self-declared leader, and executed by an army that once stood in the shadows but has now stepped fully into the light. Captain Traore is not a conventional head of state. He didn't rise through elections or diplomatic handshakes. He came to power in 2022 after overthrowing President Paul-Henri Damiba in a coup backed by frustrated soldiers and disillusioned citizens. Since then, Traoré has positioned himself as a nationalist figure, determined to liberate his country from both terror and the long reach of foreign influence. This latest military operation was not a routine patrol, it was a statement. For months, insurgent groups had operated with impunity in the northern corridor, an area once dominated by al-Qaeda-linked factions, Islamic State offshoots, and violent bandit militias. These were groups that targeted schools, looted villages, kidnapped civilians, and assassinated local leaders. For many people in the region, terror had become part of daily life. Fields were left uncultivated, markets closed early, entire towns emptied out. Then came the strike. What unfolded has been named Operation Tempête de Feu, Firestorm. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment clash, it was months in the making. Intelligence gathering started quietly, led not only by soldiers, but also by everyday civilians, nomadic herders, merchants, and farmers who had grown tired of waiting for outside help that never came. Reports say these locals tracked militant convoys, logged suspicious activities, and reported movements directly to military channels. In doing so, they became the eyes and ears of Burkina Faso's counter-terror effort. According to military sources, the insurgents were advancing through the Arbinda corridor, a notorious stretch of territory used as a transit point for weapons and fighters. The convoy was large, over 1,000 strong, and armed with machine guns, rocket launchers, and motorcycles used for quick attacks. But as they made their way through the dusty terrain that morning, they had no idea what was coming. Burkina Faso's army had set the trap with ruthless efficiency. Airborne drones monitored the convoy's movement. Snipers positioned themselves along high ridges. Armored units quietly sealed off escape paths. The air assault began just after dawn. Helicopters launched missile strikes while ground forces flanked both sides of the route. Many of the soldiers came from elite units, including the Cobra Commandos and the Rapid Intervention Battalion. But they weren't alone. Civilian defense groups, known locally as the VDPs, Volontaires pour la Défense de la Patrie, were on the front lines too. Armed with old rifles and even machetes, these volunteers struck hard and fast, operating in tight coordination with the formal military units. The battle raged for 6 hours. By the time the smoke cleared, over 1,000 militants were dead. A few survivors escaped, wounded and scattered. The rest were gone. Burkina Faso's government called it a decisive victory. The people, on the other hand, called it something more: justice. The symbolism of this operation cannot be overstated. For years, Burkina Faso has been painted by international analysts as a country on the verge of collapse. Its army, underfunded and demoralized. Its borders, porous and lawless. And its people held hostage by extremist violence and economic despair. But in this ambush, something shifted. The country didn't just win a battle, it reclaimed its narrative. Traoré, in a speech broadcast by radio shortly after the operation, didn't mince words. Burkina Faso is not a colony, he said. We are the sons and daughters of this land, and we will defend it with our lives. His words landed hard. Across towns and villages, spontaneous celebrations erupted. In places like Barcelogo and Kaya, people beat drums, sang old resistance songs, and shared food in communal gatherings. Murals of Traoré's face began appearing on street walls, some depicting him as a lion, others as a protector standing tall against a burning backdrop. Still, behind the celebrations is a deeper, more complex story. This wasn't just a triumph of firepower. It was the result of a growing model of security that blends state military action with local intelligence and citizen participation. Under Traore, Burkina Faso has restructured much of its defense strategy to rely on what officials call zones of popular vigilance. These are areas where local residents are trained, armed, and encouraged to report suspicious activity, transforming entire communities into early warning systems. The Fulani, Mossi, and Gourmancha communities played a central role in this latest operation. Many of them have suffered brutal attacks by terrorists in recent years, burned villages, poisoned wells, and abducted children. Their collaboration with the military wasn't just strategic, it was personal. One local elder speaking to a community radio station said, "We gave them the names, the routes, the faces. We did it not for reward, but because we were tired of burying our sons." His words reflect a shift in mentality across the region. Where once there was despair, there is now determination. The Cobra forces, a special unit heavily involved in the operation, have also become a subject of fascination and pride. Known for their discipline and ideological commitment, they are seen by many as the embodiment of a new Burkina Faso. They wear patches bearing the likeness of Thomas Sankara, the country's revolutionary hero of the 1980s. Some of them even recite Sankara's quotes before entering battle. One Cobra sergeant interviewed after the ambush said, "We don't just fight with weapons, we fight with memories. Every child taken, every elder killed, that's our reason." His words speak to a force driven by something more than orders, a force that believes in something deeper than victory. But not all the headlines are celebratory. The operation came at a cost. Several soldiers and VDP fighters lost their lives. Funerals were held quietly but with honor. In the town of Djibo, one widow told reporters, "He died so our children could sleep without fear. That's enough for me." In many African traditions, such losses are not seen as ends, but as transformations. These fallen fighters are now remembered as ancestors of the struggle, spirits who will guide future battles. This is the story of a country that was written off and is now writing its own story, not with press releases, but with action, not through aid packages, but through unity. In the valleys of northern Burkina Faso, where silence once signaled death, today it means something else. The calm after a storm that changed everything. The ambush in the Arbinda corridor didn't just take out over 1,000 militants, it shifted the balance of power in the region, and that ripple is now being felt far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Mali, Niger, and even parts of northern Nigeria, military officials are reportedly studying the tactics used by Captain Ibrahim Traore's forces. Not just because of the sheer number of insurgents killed, but because the operation was pulled off without foreign assistance. No NATO guidance, no French airstrikes, no American drones, just Burkinabe troops and civilians who knew their land better than any satellite image could offer. This marks a turning point in the region's counter-terrorism playbook. For years, West African nations were told that security would come through alliances with Western powers, through peacekeeping missions, counterinsurgency advisors, and heavily bureaucratic aid programs. But what Burkina Faso has just shown is that raw intelligence, trust in local communities, and bold leadership can often outperform distant strategy rooms and foreign-led military bases. The response from neighboring countries was swift. Mali and Niger, both under military leadership after recent coups, sent messages of solidarity. State radio in Bamako aired a speech praising the courage and clarity of purpose shown by Traore. In Niamey, a spokesperson from the transitional government emphasized the need for a coordinated West African solution to a West African problem. That's not just rhetoric. Behind the scenes, military officials from the three countries are said to be laying groundwork for expanded joint operations under the Alliance of Sahel States, a newly formed political and security bloc composed of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What began as a reaction to terrorist threats is quietly turning into a pan-African power movement, one determined to shift away from foreign dependency and toward regional sovereignty. AES is already gaining traction. In fact, some West African analysts now refer to it as a counterweight to the Economic Community of West African States, which has increasingly found itself at odds with these military-led governments. Tensions came to a head earlier this year when ECOWAS threatened sanctions against Burkina Faso over its refusal to transition to civilian rule. Traore responded not with diplomacy, but defiance. "We are building something new," he said at the time. "It will not look like the old order." That statement, once dismissed as populist rhetoric, now carries the weight of military victory. The success of Operation Firestorm has given Traore and his allies something they previously lacked, proof of concept. But success comes with risks. One concern now spreading across diplomatic circles is how this bold new stance could provoke international backlash. France, which maintains influence in parts of the Sahel, has been quietly sidelined in recent years. In 2023, French troops were formally withdrawn from Burkina Faso after growing tensions with the Traore administration. Their departure left a vacuum, but now that vacuum is being filled not by chaos, but by a new structure of African-led security. This reorientation doesn't sit well with everyone. Some European diplomats have already voiced concern about the direction Burkina Faso is heading. A leaked memo from an EU security advisor described the country as increasingly militant, ideologically rigid, and geopolitically unstable. The memo warned that a full break from Western cooperation could have economic consequences, including stalled aid programs and investment pullouts. Traore doesn't seem bothered. His speeches have grown sharper, more Pan-African in tone. He invokes the legacy of Thomas Sankara often, not just as a revolutionary leader, but as a symbol of what Africa can achieve without external control. "We are not against the world," he recently said in an address to university students, "but we are for ourselves, and that changes everything." Back home, the effects of the operation are still unfolding. Security forces have launched follow-up raids in several regions once considered militant strongholds. The government is distributing food and medical aid to villages previously cut off by violence. Roads once too dangerous to travel are beginning to reopen. Local officials say some internally displaced families are finally returning home, but challenges remain. Militant groups, while weakened, have not disappeared. In the days following the ambush, scattered attacks were reported in eastern Burkina Faso. Experts warn that retaliation is likely. These groups, especially those linked to transnational networks, are known for regrouping quickly, shifting operations, and adapting tactics. The Burkinabe military may have landed a historic blow, but the war is far from over. And then there's the question of governance. Traore's government is still officially transitional. There's no date for elections, no clear civilian roadmap. Critics argue that military strength alone cannot sustain a nation. Stability, they say, requires institutions, schools, courts, infrastructure. And it requires trust not just from soldiers, but from civilians who want more than just protection. They want progress. Yet for now, that debate seems muted. The mood in the country remains defiant. In towns like Djibo, Ouahigouya, and Kongoussi, posters of Traore hang next to slogans declaring La Patrie ou la mort, the homeland or death. Schools are incorporating lessons about the operation into civic education. Young people, many of whom have grown up under the shadow of war, are expressing newfound hope in local radio interviews. For them, this is more than politics, it's personal. One teacher in Dori put it this way: "Our children used to draw pictures of guns and soldiers. Now they draw flags and villages. That tells me everything I need to know." There is also a growing reverence for the fallen, those who died in the operation, both military and civilian. The government has announced plans to build a memorial site near the Arbinda corridor to honor their sacrifice. The site will include names of the dead, stories from the operation, and a training ground for future defense volunteers. It's part of what Traore calls the spirit of national rebirth. But behind every ceremony, there's still grief. Mothers who lost sons, wives who lost husbands, children who now grow up with memories instead of fathers. The price of victory, as always, is paid in blood. Yet across Burkina Faso, there's a quiet consensus that this price, while steep, was necessary. People speak of dignity more than they speak of death, of legacy more than loss. International observers are watching closely. Some are skeptical, calling it an unsustainable burst of nationalist fervor. Others are intrigued, wondering if this model, fierce local defense, community-led intelligence, and a rejection of foreign control, might inspire similar movements in other conflict zones. In Africa, the sentiment is spreading. Leaders from Chad, Guinea, and even Ethiopia have sent messages of support. Youth movements in Ghana and Kenya have started circulating Traore's speeches online. A popular meme now circulates on social media: "Africa doesn't beg, Africa defends." Back in Ouagadougou, Captain Traore remains quiet about the specifics of what's next. In his last public address, he simply said, "The land is ours, and it will be our children who decide how to grow it." That may be the most telling line of all. The dust may have settled in Arbinda, but the world has not stopped talking. The ambush that wiped out more than 1,000 insurgents in northern Burkina Faso is now making waves far beyond West Africa. From Washington to Paris, Beijing to Nairobi, analysts are scrambling to make sense of what just happened and what it means for the global order. At the heart of the conversation is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man who has gone from unknown revolutionary to one of the most talked about leaders on the continent. To some, he's a bold visionary shaking off the chains of neo-colonialism. To others, he's a military strongman carving power through force and propaganda. But one thing is clear: Traore has changed the conversation. International news outlets, long accustomed to covering Burkina Faso in the context of humanitarian crises, are now running headlines about military effectiveness, sovereignty, and self-determination. African forums are buzzing with debate about whether Traore's model of grassroots defense and Pan-African pride could work in places like Somalia, South Sudan, or even the Democratic Republic of Congo. The West, however, is not celebrating. In Paris, officials at the Quai d'Orsay have called the development deeply concerning, especially given Traore's repeated rejection of French military assistance and his sharp rhetoric against foreign influence. A source within the French government, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted that Paris is losing control of the Sahel narrative. France, which once maintained a robust counter-terror presence in Burkina Faso through Operation Barkhane, has been steadily pushed out, not just physically, but symbolically. The tricolor flag that once flew beside Burkinabe forces now flutters only in memory. The U.S. State Department has so far responded cautiously. In a press briefing, a spokesperson said the United States welcomes efforts to combat terrorism in the Sahel, but encourages all parties to uphold democratic values and human rights. The statement didn't mention Traore by name. Privately, however, Western governments are said to be monitoring the situation with growing discomfort. One European diplomat stationed in Accra described Traore's rise as a dangerous blend of charisma and firepower, but that view isn't shared across the board. In much of the global south, especially in parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, the tone is different. Commentaries in Kenyan, Rwandan, and South African newspapers praise Burkina Faso's operation as a model for post-colonial defense. Op-eds in India and Brazil frame it as a rejection of global double standards, where sovereignty is respected only when it serves major powers. Even Russia and China have taken note. Russian state media highlighted Traore's operation as proof of Western failure in Africa, while Chinese outlets framed it as an example of local solutions for local problems. The geopolitical undercurrents are undeniable. Traore is not just fighting militants. He's fighting a narrative that says African countries cannot solve their own security crises without foreign aid, UN mandates, or Western military bases. By proving otherwise, he's rewriting not just Burkina Faso's story, but a much larger one. Still, not everyone in Burkina Faso is on board. Civil society groups and political activists are beginning to ask hard questions. There is still no formal plan for elections. Opposition voices are muted or exiled. Human rights organizations have expressed concerns about the lack of transparency in security operations and the risk of civilian casualties. While most agree that the ambush was a stunning military success, some fear that it could be used to justify indefinite military rule. In response, the government has remained vague. Officials continue to stress the importance of national security and rebuilding local institutions before any political transition. They argue that premature democracy could unravel hard-won gains and plunge the country back into chaos. This argument isn't new. It echoes debates across post-conflict regions, between order and freedom, between stability and rights. And in Burkina Faso, it's a tension that will only grow louder with time. Meanwhile, Traore's image continues to evolve. He's now being called the Lion of Ouagadougou in local media. Songs are being written about him. Children in schools are learning his name. But such rapid hero worship comes with risks. Personality cults, no matter how well-intentioned, can easily slide into authoritarianism. History offers more than enough examples. Still, Traore seems aware of the weight he carries. In a recent address to military recruits, he said, "Do not follow me because of my face. Follow the mission, protect the people, serve the land. If I fall, another must rise." His words struck a chord, but also raised questions. Is he grooming a movement or consolidating a regime? At the same time, there's growing interest in how Burkina Faso's strategy could be formalized and exported. The idea of zones de veille populaire, areas where civilians are trained to support national security, is already being studied in Mali and Niger. Military academies in Senegal and Ghana are requesting briefings on Operation Firestorm. Some believe that this could form the basis for a new doctrine, an African model of defense rooted in history, geography, and culture, not imported from foreign powers. That's the broader vision Traore is now pushing, and he's not alone. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, is quietly expanding its reach. Meetings are being held about cross-border patrols, intelligence sharing, and joint command structures. There is even talk of creating a regional defense academy, an institution that would train soldiers not just in combat but in ethics, community engagement, and post-colonial identity. For now, these ideas remain early sketches, but they reflect a deep hunger across the Sahel for something that feels owned, something that cannot be revoked by foreign capitals or redirected by donor whims. Of course, none of this guarantees long-term peace. The insurgents are wounded, not eliminated. The political institutions remain weak, and the country's economy, though more stable than it was a year ago, is still fragile. But for the first time in a long time, there is momentum. There is pride in the air, not fear. In villages once terrorized by night raids, children are walking to school again, farmers are returning to their fields, traders are reopening their stalls, and across the nation the drums of resilience beat louder than ever. What happens next will depend on choices made in the coming weeks and months. Traore will have to decide whether he wants to be a liberator or a ruler, a transformer, or just another man in uniform. Burkina Faso's people will need to demand accountability without losing their faith in security. And the world, especially those used to dictating Africa's future, will need to listen rather than lecture. One ambush has changed the map, but the real battle is just beginning. The battle for what kind of future will rise from the rubble. In that future, there are no guarantees, only this: Burkina Faso will no longer wait. What do you think about the rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the bold steps taken by Burkina Faso? Is this the beginning of true African sovereignty, or are there hidden dangers ahead? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like the video to support this kind of raw, unfiltered reporting. And if you haven't already, subscribe to stay updated on Africa's most important transformations, beyond the headlines and into the heart of the story. The world is watching. Are you?